Are the jobs of Uber drivers or those riders who deliver takeaways for Deliveroo flexible? Or are they insecure? Are they independent workers or unprotected? Part of the so-called gig economy or the on-demand revolution? The words you choose to use can be very revealing of your attitude. What's more, they can make a significant difference to whether people have legal rights as workers to things like sick and maternity pay and the minimum wage, and whether the firms which employ them have to pay national insurance. Today, a report written by Tony Blair's former head of policy, Matthew Taylor, and commissioned by the government, recommends a way to be clearer about who's really self-employed and who's really a worker. We'll hear from him in around an hour's time. First, though, let's hear from the Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Labour's Rebecca Long-Bailey. Morning to you.
Morning.
What is the language you use, Rebecca? Do you regard these as flexible jobs or insecure jobs for tax-avoiding companies?
Well, you have to look at the specifics of the particular job itself and the company that's, administering that job. We've seen recent case law that suggests that companies such as Uber, for example, have been exploiting workers and exploiting the flexible arrangements that are in place. And it's important to have flexibility in the workplace, but it has to be a two-way flexibility. It has to be a flexibility that's enjoyed by the worker and the employer. And
Just
with many of these situations, it's one-sided.
Yeah, forgive me, sorry. To finish your point and then I'll ask you the question. Go on.
So I was going to say that the flexibility has to be a two-way street, and I think Matthew Taylor makes the point in his report, but with a lot of these situations it's a one-sided flexibility arrangement where the flexibility is all on the side of the employer, and that's not fair for workers and it leads to exploitation, unfortunately.
Yeah, I want to ask you in a second about specific ideas for what you might do about that, but in a sense I want to know where Labour is coming from on this. Do you, for example, and I know there are people who do you refuse to ever take an Uber because you just don't think morally it's quite right? Would you not use Deliveroo, for example, because you think they treat the workers badly and they don't pay the taxes they should?
Well, I don't personally use Uber because I don't feel that it was morally acceptable, but that's not to say that they can't reform their practices. And
Why is it morally unacceptable?
Well, I don't like the way that they're exploiting their workers, and I think the recent case proved that in the courts, that suggested that the workers that were there were in fact workers and they weren't flexible workers, and they needed to be given the adequate amount of protection and rights that workers enjoy. And I don't want to see companies to model their, operations on the Uber model. If I think the recent case, well, not so recent, it was quite some time ago, Street v Mountford basically works on the principle that if it looks like a job, if it smells like a job, then it is a job, and that the worker should be employed. And I think in those situations where workers are carrying out work on behalf of an employer, they're carrying out hours, they're addressing instructions, and they are operating in the way that a worker would operate, they should be employed as workers and not exploited as a flexible worker.
Now,
and
clearly there are workers who object to this, and they've been represented by unions and others in taking legal action. But a survey done by the Chancellor Institute of Personnel and Development found that people on these sorts of jobs were as satisfied, or if you like, as unsatisfied as any other worker. Many of them like the flexibility, many of them want it, many of them are nervous that if you force companies to give them many more rights, the jobs will go. That's what will happen, because it'll just simply become too expensive to employ people.
Well, no, look, there's two types of flexibility. There's the type of workplace flexibility where you would have, say, for example, a high-skilled worker who would like to have a flexible job. Their skills would be in demand. They would have better security, better pay, and that's good for the economy. And we need to nurture that type of flexibility because we want people to be able to make those lifestyle choices. But then there's the other form of flexibility, which is a one-sided flexibility, and that's the point I made earlier, where the flexibility lies with the employer rather than the employee, and that often affects low paid and precarious work.
So Taylor proposes a new status, doesn't he? He effectively says instead of you either having to be a full worker with full rights or self-employed, have a new status that could be given some people to give them some minimal rights without the high costs. Will Labour work with the government to legislate for that new status?
Well, I think he referred to the status of a dependent contractor, and I haven't seen the final report, so I'll await the detail and I'll have a look at that very carefully. But what I would say, and it would echo the comments that have been made by the TUC, is that we don't really need a new status, that the court victories that we've had so far have proved that many of these so-called self-employed people who work for the likes of Uber, for example, are workers and should be given adequate protections. And I do worry that if this isn't dealt with in insufficient detail, it could undermine the court rulings of Uber, for example, which was hoped to have wide-ranging implications for the industry.
OK, one last one, if I may. There's another thing in this wide-ranging report. Matthew Taylor says that we should see an end to the cash-in-hand economy. You know, if you employ someone to clean your windows or do a bit of gardening and so on, they should be paid by a credit card or an app, says Taylor, not in cash, and then the country would get the tax that it ought to from those workers. Again, would you refuse, personally, to give someone cash in hand?
No, I mean, you think you need to have a look at the situation as it arises, really.
So you would give cash in hand?
Well, it would be quite different. Well, for example, if I take a taxi in Manchester...
But that's different. That's not avoiding tax, is it?
Well, no, but I mean, I would be paying the taxi driver cash in hand. I don't know whether the taxi driver is going to pay their tax or not. So what I would say is that it's certainly something that needs to be addressed. And I think the government can do more to encourage the use of online platforms. But it needs to be careful that they're regulated and that they don't exploit and take cuts and fees, for example, from the employee itself.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.